to this Wednesday today. Fred Jackson sitting in for Kevin McCullough again today. A busy news day, much to talk about. But let's talk about the weather first. I feel sorry for you folks who live along the East Coast there. Virginia, Pennsylvania, living in the snowbanks. Enough snow around. Maybe you're probably going to have a white Christmas, and probably that's okay. But, you know, it all came on a day yesterday, that latest snowstorm, when the Obama administration was announcing they've hired John Podesta to go back in the White House. Now, you may remember him from the Clinton White House years. And President Obama said the reason he hired him was because he wants Podesta's help to advance the climate change agenda of the White House. Now, of course, climate change, we all know, is the name they had to give instead of global warming, because people just aren't accepting global warming anymore. Our home base is here in Mississippi. They had a Christmas parade. Yeah, that's what they call a Christmas parade, not holiday parade. They had a Christmas parade in our hometown last night. And folks, it was 25 degrees Fahrenheit in Mississippi. And it's not officially winter yet on the calendar. And, so it's getting harder and harder, whether you live on the East Coast, you live in the center part of the country, or God bless you, you live up on the plains, up in the upper Northwest there. Everybody is getting like in the middle of winter type weather. And as I say, it's not even winter yet. And still, this administration is trying to sell us on the idea of global warming. It's all kind of blowing up in their face and really getting hard to convince people that there is a problem there. Well, on to the news of the day. Speaking of problems, you may have heard the news this morning that there's been a bipartisan plan put together by Republican Paul Ryan in the House and Democrat Senator Patty Murray yesterday. They're calling it the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. Now, some conservatives might refer to it as the Republican Capitulation Budget Act of 2013, because basically it adds up to this. They're going to blow right through the spending caps that were put in place back a few years ago. And you may have also heard this morning that we're going to do all this and we're not going to raise any taxes. But that's not true either, because, fees, there's a thing called fees. And this budget plan that's been put in place, this so-called bipartisan plan, has some really significant fee increases. Well, there are some House Republicans that are not happy about it. Now, the Associated Press is reporting at this hour that there was a GOP caucus meeting this morning, and they came out, they said the majority seemed to be in favor of it going forward. Now, the assessment basically is this, folks. The Republicans, you remember back just several weeks ago, the government shut down. It was really a partial government shutdown. But the Republicans got the flack from the mainstream media. The Democrats blamed the Republicans, the mainstream media complicit in that kind of blame game. And the feeling is the Republicans got so whacked on that they decided they had to do some compromising. And that is why we are seeing this compromise out there today. Senator Rand Paul this morning saying, who's, by the way, a potential 2016 presidential candidate, says he's against it. He says it's undoing tens of billions of dollars of this modest spending restraint, and it's shameful and must be opposed. Now, I talked about these fees, and I tell you what, you really do get tired of this dishonesty, don't you, out there? We're not going to tax you anymore, but let's not talk about the fee increases. Among the fee increases that you're going to see, it would raise the Transportation Security Administration fee on a typical nonstop round-trip airline ticket from $5 to $10. Now, you may say, okay, that's the TSA fee, the Transportation Security Administration fee. Well, guess who's going to pay for that? Well, the way we are going to pay for that, and the airline, at least the CEO of Delta Airlines, very quick to respond to it this morning. He says, we're just going to pass this along to the passengers, folks. His CEO, Richard Anderson, calls the fee a tax, and it says he means fares are going to go up. He says the increase will not be absorbed by Delta Airlines. And I'm sure the other airlines are the same way. So there you go. A fee that was $5 is now up to $10. Now, there are some other things you need to know about this so-called Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. It would also require newly hired federal workers to contribute 1.3 percentage points more of their salaries towards their pensions, all right? And trim cost of living adjustments to the pensions of military retirees under the age of 62. All right, so those cost of living that they normally would get, and cost of living is put in place, folks, to absorb the shock of the cost of living going up. So what that basically adds up to, when these kinds of things happen, what that adds up to, folks, is that the take-home pay of our military personnel are going to go down. That's what it adds up to. Hospitals and other healthcare providers would have to absorb 2 additional years of a 2 percentage point cut in their Medicare reimbursements. Now, what does that mean? Well, that is going to discourage more and more doctors from taking Medicare patients. That's what that adds up to. The doctors have already been saying, many doctors have been saying, we cannot afford. These doctors say, and I know everybody thinks, the doctors are really wealthy, so they should, just keep their mouths shut and not complain about these kinds of things. But here's the reality. Doctors, let's take a general practitioner. They have office expenses too. They have office staff to pay, and they have to pay these huge liability insurance premiums. There are some GPs that are paying over $200,000 a year for liability insurance because our federal government would not deal with so-called tort reform to put a cap on when somebody wants to sue a doctor over a particular issue. So these doctors have been saying we can't continue to operate our offices with these cuts in the reimbursements that we are getting from the federal government for Medicare patients. And so they start dropping these patients. This is the kind of budget deal that has been put in place, folks. And as I say, there are apparently, if you believe the Associated Press and this story that just came in 15 minutes ago, reporting on this meeting of Republicans this morning in Washington, they're saying the majority are okay with it. But there are plenty of Republicans who are not, and also Democrats, even Nancy Pelosi, saying this morning, giving it less than an endorsement in her assessment of it. We also have comments this morning from Senator Tom Coburn, Republican of Oklahoma. He points to a government waste book, which outlines $25 billion in wasteful government spending, and none of that is addressed in this budget deal. You see, folks, this is the kind of thing that drives us crazy, isn't it? That the government puts together a book which outlines $25 billion in wasteful government spending, and this budget deal does nothing to deal with that. It's amazing. None of the waste, Senator Coburn says, none of the waste, the duplication, the fraud, none of it. And yet we're going to raise spending back up because the political powers that be want to spend more money rather than be responsible with what we know needs to be done up here, which is hard work, eliminating all the stupidity and fraud, duplication that's going on, end quote, from Senator Tom Coburn there. I think he's reflecting where the vast majority of Americans are with this issue. Another Republican member of the House, Tim Hulskamp of Kansas, he pointed to the sequester, which imposed mandatory hard caps on spending. That was the deal that led to that partial government shutdown because Republicans took a stand saying we had a deal that we put in place back a couple of years ago. We were told the American people we weren't going to raise the spending. But as Hulskamp says, they're blowing right through that. They're going to spend billions more. They're going through that cap on spending, along with raising those fees that will cost Americans more. The Americans for Prosperity, which is a limited government free market advocacy group, call the budget deal bad policy and bad politics. The group's president, Tim Phillips, says the American people remember hard-won bipartisan spending limits set by the sequester and are not pleased to see their conservative representatives so easily go back on their word to rein in government overspending. Spending levels were set by law at $967 billion, exceeding those levels, he says, by $45 billion, takes us in the wrong direction, further from fiscal responsibility and further from the promise to the American people. Also, our own Dan Celia, Financial Issues, on his program this morning, he calls it a win for the Democrats because they get an increase in spending and increases. Republicans get a win because they're not the bad guys shutting down the government because they don't have the competency or any abilities whatsoever to counter the argument that the government shutdown was negative, end quote, from Dan Celia. So there you have it, folks. Probably what you're going to see on your newscast tonight, your network newscast, is a bit of celebration from both Republicans and Democrats, most of them, probably willing to go along with this because next year is an election year. I read there a moment ago Nancy Pelosi's reaction to it. Well, she would like to see the Republicans continue to be blamed for problems, obviously going into election year. But it looks like they're going to have enough votes both in the Senate and in the House to pass this thing. But if there was ever a case of kicking the can down the road on an issue so important to the American people, and this is why the level of frustration, folks, all the polls are showing it, the level of frustration of the American people against what's going on in Washington, D.C. continues to grow. You know, for us, we here who live in the real world outside of Washington, we don't have this option. We don't have the option to say, well, I'm just going to spend a whole lot more. Because you know what? We live in the real world, and we have bankers who say, no, I'm not going to lend you any more money. Your credit card has reached its limit, so you can't use that anymore. We live in that kind of world, and we have to make adjustments. But our politicians, and as Dan Celia and others are pointing out, our politicians are not willing to do that hard work that needs to be done. So there you have it. As I say, they're calling it officially the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. It is basically saying goodbye to spending restrictions. We're going to blow through those caps that were put in place back a few years ago, and we're not only going to spend more money, and don't be fooled. I want to remind you once again, don't be fooled tonight when you listen to those network newscasts as saying, hey, there's no new taxes. Well, as others have pointed out, there are new fees that are putting in place. And I'm sorry, folks, a fee is a tax. That's what it is. A fee is a tax. And you're going to be feeling it if you're a member of the military, if you happen to be traveling. You know, a lot of folks planning to travel coming up at Christmas time. Now, it may not be in place for this particular season, but you're going to see a doubling of those fees. And it'll all come out in the price of an airplane ticket. And that just hurts the economy. All right, we got to come up against a break here in about a minute. Much more to talk about. Obamacare. Kathleen Sebelius, Health and Human Services Secretary, back on the hot seat before Congress this morning. But she's singing a bright tune. She says enrollments are way up. The website is working. But way up is a relative term. What about those young people who helped elect Barack Obama 2008, 2012? There's been a turning of their points of view, folks. And we're going to be talking to somebody about that. What has happened to the youth that Barack Obama depended upon not only to get elected and reelected, but now he was depending on them to support Obamacare. And that's not happening. We're going to get into that. Much more when we return here on AFA Today. Fred Jackson sitting in for Kevin McCullough. We're back right after the break.